I need to tell you something I've never said out loud to anyone. Not to a therapist. Not to a best friend. Not even to myself, really. Not in the way that counts. Not in the way where you sit with the truth long enough for it to stop feeling like a dream you're trying to shake off. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in a beige house in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, where the lawns were always cut and the neighbors waved from their driveways and everything looked, from the outside, exactly the way a normal family is supposed to look. And for a long time, I thought maybe that was enough. Maybe looking normal was the same as being normal. Maybe feeling invisible inside your own home was just something that happened to everyone and nobody talked about it. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. But I was most wrong about my sister. Let me start with the day I found out about the will, because that's where the unraveling begins. That's the moment everything I had spent my entire childhood quietly accepting, all the little dismissals, all the small cruelties wrapped in reasonable explanations, finally added up to something I couldn't keep swallowing. It was a Tuesday in October. I remember because the leaves were that particular shade of orange that always made me feel nostalgic for something I couldn't name. I was at work when my mom called. She called in the middle of the afternoon, which she almost never did. My mom wasn't a phone call person. She was a group text person. She would send links to articles without context and expect that to count as staying in touch. So when her name lit up my screen, I felt something shift in my stomach. Something small and instinctive. The way an animal feels a change in air pressure before a storm. I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Claire," she said. And there was something in her voice. Not guilt exactly. More like the particular tone people use when they've already decided how a conversation is going to go and they just need you to catch up. "We need to talk about your grandfather's estate." My grandfather, my dad's father, Walter, had passed away 2 months earlier. He was 83. It wasn't sudden. He'd been sick for a long time, the quiet, slow kind of sick that gives everyone around it time to grieve in advance. He was a good man. He built a modest life, saved carefully, and left behind a house and some money that, by my understanding, was meant to be divided between his grandchildren. That meant me and my sister, Danielle. We were his only grandchildren. I had always assumed, and I mean genuinely, without much thought, because it had been stated more than once over the years, that the inheritance would be split evenly. 50-50. That's what Walter had told both of us at different times. I have a specific memory of being 16 and sitting in his kitchen while he made coffee and told me, very plainly, "Whatever I have, I'm leaving to you girls equally. You'll each get your half." I held on to that. Not greedily. Not obsessively. But in the background, quietly, the way you hold on to something that feels safe. A little assurance that at least in this one specific way, I would be seen the same way my sister was. So when my mom said the words that came next, "I want you to understand that it wasn't just disappointment I felt. It was the ground moving. We've decided," she said. And she said we, meaning herself and my father, which already told me this decision had been made long before this phone call, that it makes more sense to give Danielle the larger share. She's going through a difficult time financially, and she has the kids to think about. You're stable. You have your job, your apartment. You don't need it the same way she does. I stood in that hallway for a moment without saying anything. Around me, people walked past. Someone laughed in the break room. A printer started up somewhere. "What do you mean, the larger share?" I asked. And my voice came out much calmer than I felt, which is something I've always done. Stayed calm on the outside while something in my chest started tearing quietly apart. "Danielle is receiving 80%, my mother said. You'll receive 20. It's still something. It's not nothing. 20% of my grandfather's estate." The man who had looked me in the eyes and told me we would be treated equally. 20%. Because I was stable. Because I had made choices that worked out. Because I had spent my entire adult life not asking my parents for anything. Not money, not help, not rescue. And apparently the cost of being capable was that you forfeited your right to fairness. I don't remember exactly what I said next. I think I said something like, okay, and I need to get back to work. I think my mother said something about hoping I understood and that this wasn't about loving me less. I hung up and stood in that hallway for a long time. And the thing I kept coming back to, the thought that sat in my chest like a stone, wasn't even about the money. It was about the pattern. It was the fact that I wasn't even surprised. That somewhere underneath the shock, there was this horrible, exhausted part of me that had always known something like this would happen. That had been waiting for it. That recognized this moment not as an anomaly, but as a conclusion. The conclusion of a story that had been told, in 1,000 small ways, my entire life. You need to understand who Danielle is. Not the version of her that exists on her Instagram, with the clean kitchen and the smiling kids and the captions about gratitude and hard work. The real version. The one I grew up beside. Danielle is 3 years older than me. She's beautiful in a way that people notice immediately. The kind of beauty that makes strangers warm to you before you've said a word, that makes teachers give you the benefit of the doubt and make neighbors remember your name. She has my mother's coloring, dark hair and light eyes, and she's always known exactly how to use a room. Growing up, Danielle was the sun in our family's solar system. Everything orbited around her. Her school plays, her social dramas, her moods, her successes. When she did well, the whole house celebrated. When she struggled, the whole house mobilized. There was always energy around Danielle. Always urgency. Always a story happening. I was different. I was quieter, more internal. I did well in school without making it a performance. I had friends, but I didn't need to be at the center of every social situation. I was the kind of kid who read a lot and asked questions that adults sometimes didn't know how to answer and felt most comfortable in spaces where things were calm. In another family, I think those qualities might have been valued. In my family, they made me easy to overlook. It's not that my parents were cruel to me. I want to be honest about that, because this story isn't about monsters. It's about something quieter and more complicated and, in some ways, harder to name. They were attentive to me in the practical ways. I was fed and clothed and driven to appointments and helped with homework. The material basics were always there. But there's a kind of love that goes beyond the material basics, and that's the kind that requires you to actually see someone, to be curious about who they are, to notice what they care about and what hurts them and what lights them up, to make them feel like their interior world matters. That kind of love was given almost entirely to Danielle. And Danielle, I don't think she did this intentionally, at least not when we were young. Danielle absorbed it like it was water. Like it was simply hers. She never noticed what I wasn't receiving because she never had to notice. The world arranged itself around her comfort, and she moved through it with a specific confidence of someone who has never been made to feel like a secondary concern. By the time we were teenagers, a pattern had solidified in our house. If Danielle wanted something, there was a conversation about how to make it happen. If I wanted something, there was a conversation about whether it was realistic or necessary. Danielle got a car when she turned 17. I got told that public transportation was good for building independence. Danielle dropped out of her first college and transferred, and my parents paid for both schools without flinching. I received a specific amount for tuition and was told to figure out the rest, which I did. 2 jobs, careful budgeting, 3 years of being tired in a way I didn't have language for yet. None of this was ever framed as unfair. That's the thing about growing up in a system. It doesn't present itself as a system. It just presents itself as the way things are. And I was good at adapting to the way things were. After the phone call about the inheritance, I did something I almost never allowed myself to do. I sat with the feeling. Not the composed version. Not the version where I talked myself down and found the rational perspective and focused on what I could control. I sat with the actual, raw, ugly feeling. I went home that evening, made tea I didn't drink, and sat at my kitchen table while the apartment got dark around me, and I let myself feel every part of it. The humiliation of it. The specific sting of being told that my stability, the thing I had built, carefully, out of nothing, without help, was the reason I deserved less. The absurdity of being punished for not needing to be rescued. And underneath all of that, something older and harder to articulate. A grief that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with years of being the daughter who was assumed to be fine. The daughter who could handle it. The daughter who didn't require the same tenderness because she seemed, from the outside, from a comfortable distance, to not need it. I had spent so long being that daughter, and I was exhausted in a way I hadn't let myself fully acknowledge until that night. Here's what I didn't know then, sitting in my dark kitchen with my cold tea. I didn't know that 6 weeks later, I would open a small cardboard box in the mail. A DNA kit. Something I had ordered impulsively the previous summer, during a rare nostalgic mood, wanting some vague sense of ancestry and history. Something I had completely forgotten about. I didn't know that when I spit into that little tube and sent it off, I was setting in motion the single most important revelation of my life. I didn't know that the results would be back in a Thursday afternoon email with the subject line, "Your ancestry DNA results are ready." And I didn't know, not yet, that clicking that link would rewrite every single thing I thought I understood about my family. About Danielle. About why she was always the son. About why I was always something quieter, something peripheral, something the whole system seemed designed to work around. I didn't know any of that yet. But I was about to find out. The email sat unopened for almost an hour. I don't know why I hesitated. It was just a DNA test. People did them all the time. You saw the results on social media. The little pie charts showing 40% this and 20% that, cousins you didn't know you had showing up as distant matches. The mild entertainment of discovering your family wasn't quite what you thought. It was supposed to be a casual thing. A curiosity. Something to look at over coffee on a slow weekend morning. But I had ordered it during a strange, melancholy summer evening, when I was feeling untethered in a way I couldn't explain, and there was something about the timing of it. Arriving now, 6 weeks after the inheritance call, while I was still raw and rearranged, that made me sit with the unopened email longer than made any rational sense. I was at my kitchen table again. It was evening. The radiator was clicking in that irregular, almost conversational way it did when the temperature dropped, and the streetlights outside were just starting to blur orange against the window glass. I had changed out of work clothes into an old sweatshirt. I had a bowl of pasta I'd barely touched. I clicked the link. The page loaded with that familiar, cheerful interface. Colorful ethnicity circles. Percentage breakdowns. A little family tree icon. And at the top, a notification I hadn't expected. DNA matches. 1,847 relatives found. That seemed high, but I'd heard they always found a lot of distant matches. I scrolled down to look at the ethnicity breakdown, which was interesting in the way these things always are. More Eastern European than I expected, some Scandinavian, nothing that seemed wildly at odds with what I knew about my family history. I was about to close the tab. Actually, I had already moved my cursor toward the corner of the screen. And then I noticed the section labeled Close Family Matches. There were 2 names there. One was my father, Gerald Ashworth. His name was right there, tagged as a confirmed close match, because he had apparently done his own kit years ago, something I dimly remembered him mentioning once, when the tests first became popular, saying he'd done it out of curiosity about his father's side of the family. The match percentage next to his name read 24.7%. I stared at that number. I stared at it for long enough that my eyes went slightly unfocused. 24.7%. I didn't know a lot about genetics. I wasn't a scientist. But I knew enough, from casual reading, from the little explanatory text these sites always provided, to know that a parent and child were supposed to share approximately 50% of their DNA. Give or take a few points for the random variation of inheritance. 46, 48, 52. That was the normal range. Not 24. 24 was the percentage you shared with a grandparent, or an aunt or uncle, or a half-sibling. Not a father. I sat very still. The radiator clicked. Outside, a car went past slowly, its headlights sweeping briefly across my ceiling. I read the number again. Looked at the label. Looked back at the number. Clicked on my father's profile to make sure I was reading it correctly, to make sure there wasn't some display error or some setting I was misunderstanding. Predicted relationship. Grandparent/aunt/uncle/half-sibling. Confidence. Extremely high. The pasta on the table had gone completely cold. I need to tell you what my father is like, so you understand the specific quality of the shock I was sitting inside. Gerald Ashworth is a quiet man. Methodical. He worked for the same engineering firm for 31 years and retired with a small ceremony and a plaque that he put in the garage because he said he didn't want it in the living room, but my mother wanted him to display it, so the garage was the compromise. He coached my sister's soccer team when she was 9 and 10 and 11. He made pancakes on Saturday mornings when we were small. He wasn't warm in an expressive way. He didn't say, "I love you" easily, didn't initiate hugs, communicated affection mostly through action and presence rather than words. But he was there. Consistent. Reliable. The kind of father whose love you assumed rather than felt. And I had assumed it. I had assumed it my entire life. I had assumed it through every instance of Danielle being chosen first, being helped first, being seen first. I had told myself that my father, even if he wasn't effusive, loved me the same. Even when he forgot to come to my college graduation because he mixed up the dates, which my mother later told me was an honest mistake, and I believed her, or told myself I did. Even when he handed Danielle the keys to the car on her 17th birthday and told me, 2 years later, that the world required more independence from girls like me. Even then, I thought I was his daughter. 24.7%. I closed my laptop. Opened it again immediately. Looked at the number again. Closed it again. I got up and walked to the window and stood there with my arms wrapped around myself, looking at the street below, which was ordinary and quiet and completely indifferent to the fact that everything inside me had just been quietly detonated. The thought I kept circling, the one I couldn't land on or pull away from, was this: if Gerald Ashworth was not my biological father, then who was? And, if he knew, had he always known? And the one beneath both of those, the one I almost didn't let myself think, the one that arrived not as a sentence but as a cold, spreading feeling in my chest. Was this why? Was this fundamental, biological, secret difference? Was this the invisible thing that had always lived in the gap between how Danielle was treated and how I was treated? Was this the explanation I had spent my entire childhood reaching for in the dark and never finding? I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed and watched the shadows on my ceiling rearrange themselves as cars passed outside, and I turned the question over and over until it had worn completely smooth and still made no sense. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to work. I answered emails. I went to the grocery store. I called my mother once, briefly, and talked about nothing. The weather, a show she was watching, something Danielle's kids had done that was apparently very cute. I held the phone to my ear and participated in the conversation with the surface of myself while the deeper part of me was somewhere else entirely, turning over a question I wasn't ready to ask out loud. During those 2 weeks, I did research. Quietly, carefully, the way I did most things. I read everything I could find about DNA test accuracy, about the specific percentage ranges for different relationships, about the statistical likelihood of error. I wanted very badly to find a reason to dismiss the result. An explanation. A loophole. There wasn't one. The science was clear and consistent across every source I found. A 24.7% DNA match with someone labeled as a parent meant one thing. It meant he wasn't my parent. Not biologically. The margin of error in these tests was a fraction of a percent. There was no version of the genetics in which Gerald Ashworth was my father. I also, during those 2 weeks, started looking at photographs differently. This is something I'm almost embarrassed to admit, because it sounds like something from a bad movie. But it's true. I started looking at photos of my family with new eyes, and what I saw, or thought I saw, or maybe just allowed myself to see for the first time, was the thing that had always been slightly off, slightly unexplained, slightly papered over with the assumption of normalcy. Danielle looked like my parents. Genuinely. Unmistakably. She had my mother's dark hair and the particular set of my father's jaw and something in her eyes that was recognizably, clearly a genetic inheritance from the two of them. You could look at a photo of my parents at 25 and look at Danielle and understand exactly where she came from. I didn't look like that. I had always attributed this to being the one who took after some other branch of the family. It happened. People looked like their grandparents, their aunts, the distant cousin twice removed. My mother had told me once that I looked like her mother's sister, a woman who had died before I was born, and I had accepted that explanation completely. I had wanted to accept it. But now I was sitting with a photograph of the four of us. My parents, Danielle, me, taken at some family gathering when I was maybe 12, and what I was seeing was 3 people who shared a clear, undeniable visual language, and one person who was standing among them. I had always been the one person who was standing among them. I want to be careful about how I tell what happened next, because it would be very easy to make it sound like I became someone else. Someone driven by anger, plotting in the dark, methodically constructing a revenge. That's not quite what happened. What happened was slower and more human and, honestly, more painful than revenge would have been. What happened was that I started grieving. Not for the money, though that was part of it, yes. Not just for the inheritance, though the inheritance had become a symbol of something much larger and much older than itself. I started grieving for my childhood. For the specific version of my childhood where I had been the less loved daughter for reasons I had always assumed were somehow my fault. Too quiet. Too serious. Not charming enough. Not needy enough. Not magnetic enough. And now I was sitting with the possibility, no, the near certainty, that the reason had nothing to do with me at all. That there was a secret at the center of my family. A secret that explained the invisible wall I had always felt between myself and the warmth that seemed to radiate naturally toward Danielle. A secret that my parents had been carrying, possibly for my entire life. That realization didn't feel like power. Not yet. It felt like loss. A very specific, very quiet kind of loss. The kind that arrives not with a crash but with a slow, expanding sadness. The sadness of understanding that the story you told yourself about your life was built on ground that was never quite solid. I cried, actually. Multiple times, during those 2 weeks. Ugly crying, alone in my apartment, the kind where you're not even sure what you're crying about exactly because it's not one thing, it's 31 years of things that you finally stopped telling yourself were reasonable. And then, somewhere in the middle of the 2nd week, something else started to happen. Quietly, underneath the grief, something else was beginning to take shape. I had always been the daughter who handled things, who figured things out, who survived without being rescued. And now I had information that none of them knew I had. Information that changed everything, not just for me, but potentially for the entire architecture of my family's secrets and justifications and careful, self-serving stories. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do with it. But for the first time in my life, I had something they didn't. It was Danielle who called me, as it happened, that particular Friday evening. Not my mother. Danielle. She called around 8, which was unusual. Danielle and I weren't close in the way that people who grew up together are sometimes close. The closeness built from shared bedrooms and shared parents and long car trips. We were polite. We showed up to family events. We texted occasionally, usually surface things, memes or quick check-ins. But she didn't call me often. I almost didn't answer. But I did. "Hey," she said. She had that easy, settled tone she always had, the tone of someone who has never had to calculate whether they were welcome in a conversation. "I've been meaning to call you. About the inheritance thing." I waited. "I hope you're not upset about it," she said. And her voice was warm. That was the thing about Danielle. Her voice was always warm. It was one of the most disarming things about her. I told Mom and Dad they should be the ones to explain it, but I know how they are. They're not great at difficult conversations. "It was a surprise," I said carefully. "Yeah, I bet." She paused. "I want you to know that I didn't ask for that. I want you to know that. It wasn't like I went to them and said, 'Give me more.' They made that decision on their own. And here is where I have to be honest with you. I almost believed her. Because Danielle was good at this, at positioning herself adjacent to the difficult thing while maintaining clean hands. And because I had spent my life giving her the benefit of the doubt in ways I had never fully examined. But I was different now than I had been 6 weeks ago. Something in me had shifted, had been shifting slowly and was now, in the wake of that DNA result, shifting faster. "Why do you think they made that decision?" I asked. A small pause. "Because they worry about me," she said. "You know how they are. They've always worried more about me because—" She trailed off. "Because what?" I said. "Because I've needed more help," she said, and her voice had a kind of practiced humility in it that I recognized now in a way I hadn't before. "You've always been the strong one, Claire. You've always figured things out. That's just who you are. The strong one." I had been hearing that my entire life. "You're so strong, Claire. You don't need us the way she does, Claire. You've always been so capable." And I thought, sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, about the DNA test open on my laptop in the next room. I thought, "You have no idea what I know." "I appreciate you calling," I said. And I kept my voice even and warm and completely unreadable. "It means a lot." After we hung up, I sat for a long moment. Then I opened my laptop. And I started making a plan. The plan didn't start with confrontation. I want to be clear about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the protagonist gets the information and immediately storms into her parents' living room and flips the table and demands answers. That's the satisfying movie version. That version has a dramatic score underneath it and a close-up on someone's shocked face, and it wraps up cleanly in about 4 minutes. Real life doesn't move like that. Real life moves the way water moves through rock. Slowly. Quietly. Without announcing itself. And by the time anyone notices, the shape of things has already changed permanently. So I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. What I did first was make sure I understood exactly what I was dealing with. Because here's the thing about having a piece of information that changes everything. It only changes everything if you're certain about it. And I was mostly certain, but mostly certain wasn't enough. Not for what this was. Not for what it meant. I ordered a second test. A different company, different methodology, same sample. I wanted a confirmation that existed completely independently of the first result. I sent it off on a Monday morning and then I waited, and the waiting was its own particular kind of discipline. Showing up to work, answering emails, making small talk in the break room, smiling at the right moments, while carrying this thing in my chest like a stone I couldn't put down. I also started doing something else during that time. I started remembering. Not the sanitized version of my childhood that I usually let myself access. The acceptable, manageable version that you bring out in polite conversation, the one with the smoothed edges and the reasonable explanations. I mean, I started going back into the actual memories. The specific ones. The ones I had spent years filing away in a place where they couldn't bother me too much. I thought about the summer I was 7 and Danielle was 10, when our family took a trip to a lake house with my father's parents. My grandfather Walter was there. The same Walter who would, decades later, leave behind the inheritance that would become the fault line of everything. At that lake house, I have a memory of sitting on the dock with him in the early morning while everyone else was still asleep. Just the two of us and the water and the sound of birds. And Walter had put his hand on top of mine and said, very quietly, "You're a good girl, Claire. You're a very good girl." I had treasured that memory for years. It had felt like being seen by someone who understood something. Now I thought about it differently. What if that tenderness, that specific, deliberate tenderness, had been something more than grandfatherly affection? What if Walter had known something? What if that moment on the dock was a man trying, in the only language available to him, to give something to a child he understood was being quietly shortchanged? I couldn't know. Walter was gone. That door was closed. But the question sat with me. And it joined all the other questions that were now reorganizing themselves into a coherent shape. The second test came back on a Wednesday afternoon. Same result. Different company, different sample, same undeniable mathematics. Gerald Ashworth was not my biological father. I sat with the confirmation for a long time. And what I felt, which surprised me, wasn't the devastation of the first result or the shaky unreality of those 2 weeks of waiting. What I felt was something closer to steadiness. The specific kind of steadiness that arrives when uncertainty finally collapses into certainty. When you stop bracing for the answer because the answer is already there. It was real. It was confirmed. And now the question was no longer whether this was true. The question was, who knew? There were 3 possibilities, as I mapped them out. The first was that my mother knew. That she had always known. That she had built an entire family life on top of this secret and had spent 31 years managing it. Managing me, keeping me at a certain emotional distance, perhaps even unconsciously, because I was the visible evidence of something she needed to keep invisible. The second was that my father, Gerald, knew. That he had discovered it at some point, either early or late, and had made some private decision about how to carry it. That his particular flavor of emotional distance from me specifically was not, as I had always assumed, simply his personality, but something more intentional. More protective. More painful. The third possibility was the one that kept me awake at night. The possibility that both of them knew. That this had been a negotiated silence. A shared secret. The kind of thing that gets decided once, in some terrible private conversation long ago, and then never spoken of again, simply lived around like a piece of furniture you stop seeing because it's been there so long. And then there was a fourth question I barely let myself form, because it was the one with the most jagged edges. Did Danielle know? I am a person who, when I need to think, goes for very long walks. I've always been this way. When I was a kid and something was bothering me, I would walk around the block, or the neighborhood, or farther if I could get away with it. My mother used to say it was my way of running without running. She said it like it was a quirk, the kind of thing you say affectionately about a child. But it was more than a quirk. It was how my brain processed things that were too large to sit still with. So I walked. Every evening during those weeks after the second test, I walked. Long routes through my neighborhood and the adjacent ones, past the houses with their lit-up windows and the restaurants breathing warm air onto the sidewalk and the people walking dogs and talking on phones, all of it going on with complete indifference to the fact that my entire understanding of my own life was being rebuilt from the ground up. And what I kept coming back to, on those walks, was a specific conversation I'd had with my Aunt Rosemary about 4 years ago. Rosemary was my father's younger sister. She was a small, sharp woman with an extraordinarily dry sense of humor and a habit of saying true things in ways that sounded almost accidental. She and I had always gotten along, which was itself a little noteworthy in the context of my family, because most of my father's relatives oriented themselves around Danielle the same way everyone else did. But Rosemary had always directed a specific, pointed attention toward me. She remembered details about my life in a way that suggested she was actually listening. She asked follow-up questions. She sent cards for my birthday, not just at Christmas. 4 years ago, we'd been sitting together at a family barbecue, slightly apart from everyone else. Rosemary had a talent for engineering small geographical escapes from family gatherings, and she had said something that I had filed away at the time as one of her cryptic observations. She had been watching Danielle hold court across the yard, laughing at the center of a group of relatives, and she had taken a sip of her drink and said, very quietly, without looking at me, "Your mother is a complicated woman, Claire. I hope you know that the story isn't always what's been told to you." I had laughed a little uncertainly. What does that mean? And Rosemary had looked at me then. A long, specific look. It means that sometimes the people who seem most confident about who deserves what, and she had paused deliberately, are the people with the most to hide. Then she'd excused herself to get another drink, and the conversation had moved on, and I had tucked her words into that internal filing cabinet I maintained for things I wasn't ready to examine and gone back to the barbecue. But now I was standing on a sidewalk 2 blocks from my apartment, in the cold October air, and I was thinking about Rosemary's look. The specific quality of it. The thing in it that had felt, even at the time, like more than a cryptic observation. It had felt like pity. Not condescending pity. The specific pity of someone who knows something you don't, and has decided they can't tell you, but can't quite stop themselves from gesturing toward the door. I took out my phone. I found Rosemary's number. I stared at it for a long time. Then I put the phone back in my pocket and kept walking. Because I wasn't ready. Not yet. Because the thing I was learning about information, about having something powerful that nobody knew you had, was that timing mattered. That moving too fast was its own kind of mistake. I had spent my entire life reacting to things that happened to me. Absorbing them, adjusting, adapting, filing them away. For once, I wanted to be ahead of something. For once, I wanted to move with intention. A month after the second test, something happened that I hadn't planned for. My parents announced they were throwing a holiday dinner. A family gathering mid-December, at their house in Columbus. This was not unusual. We gathered for the holidays every year, had for as long as I could remember. But this year my mother called to tell me that she was also inviting Danielle's in-laws, and some family friends, and that she wanted it to be a proper celebration. A celebration of what? I asked. Family, my mother said. And she said it with that particular warmth she deployed when she wanted to frame something as wholesome and uncomplicated. We've had a hard year with your grandfather passing. I want something to look forward to. That sounds nice, I said. And I meant it, actually. Because I had just decided, as she was speaking, that the holiday dinner was when I was going to call Aunt Rosemary. Not during. Not at the table in front of everyone. Before. I needed to understand what Rosemary knew. I needed to know if I was standing on the edge of a secret that one person held or the edge of something much larger, much older, much more carefully constructed. I needed, before I did anything, to understand the terrain. So I called her on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks before the dinner. Rosemary picked up on the second ring. "Claire," she said. And there was something immediately careful in her voice. Watchful. Like she had been half expecting this call for a long time. "Hey, Rosemary," I said. I was standing in my kitchen again, the same kitchen, the same window, the same streetlight blurring orange outside. "I need to ask you something." A pause. "Okay." "That thing you said to me at the barbecue," I said. 4 years ago. About my mother. About stories that aren't told. Silence. "Claire. I know something," I said quietly. I'm not guessing. I'm not fishing. I have confirmed information. And I need to know if you know what I know. Because I don't want to walk into this alone. The silence on the other end of the phone was the longest I had ever experienced. Long enough that I started to wonder if she'd put the phone down. Long enough that I was holding my breath without realizing it. And then Rosemary said, in a voice I'd never heard from her before, something stripped of its usual dry armor, something that sounded almost like relief. How long have you known? The air went out of me. A few months, I said. Does your mother know that you know? No, I said. Nobody does. Just me. Another pause. Meet me for coffee, Rosemary said. Not on the phone. In person. Before that dinner. Okay, I said. And Claire. Her voice shifted again. Became something careful and deliberate. Whatever you're planning, and I can tell you're planning something, please think it through completely. This is bigger than you understand yet. I felt something move through me. Something cold and clarifying. What do you mean bigger? I said. But Rosemary had already said goodbye. We met at a coffee shop halfway between her house and mine. A small, unremarkable place. The kind with mismatched chairs and local art on the walls and a specific smell of dark roast that hit you immediately when you walked in. Rosemary was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her coat still on and both hands wrapped around a mug, and when she looked up at me her expression was something I had never seen on her face before. She looked tired. Not physically tired. The other kind. The kind that lives behind the eyes and has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with carrying something for a very long time. I ordered coffee I didn't want and sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The ambient noise of the coffee shop moved around us. The hiss of the espresso machine, someone's laptop music leaking through headphones, a barista calling out a name. Small ordinary sounds. The kind that make extraordinary conversations feel surreal. How did you find out? Rosemary asked. DNA test, I said. Ancestry kit. I ordered it months ago and forgot about it. The results matched my father at 24%. She absorbed this. Looked down at her mug. Something moved across her face that I couldn't quite read. I've known since you were 3 years old, she said. The espresso machine hissed. Gerald told me, she continued before I could say anything. We've always been close, Gerald and I. Too close for secrets to stay perfectly sealed. He'd been drinking. This was a Christmas, I think. You were very small. And he told me. He said that your mother had come to him before you were born and told him the truth. That she had been involved with someone else. Briefly, she said. A mistake, she said. And that there was a possibility, more than a possibility, that the baby she was carrying wasn't his. I was very still. He stayed, Rosemary said. That's the thing I need you to understand first. He chose to stay. He chose to raise you. And in his mind, I think that choice meant something real. I think he genuinely believed for a long time that choosing you was the same as you being his. But it wasn't the same, I said. No, she said quietly. It wasn't. She looked at me directly then. Claire, I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Okay. Are you planning to use this? At the dinner, or before it, or are you planning to tell your parents what you know? I took a breath. I'm planning to understand the full picture first. And then yes. I'm planning to say something. Rosemary nodded slowly. Not surprised. Something that looked almost like acceptance. Then there are things you need to know, she said. Things that go beyond Gerald and what he chose. She looked down at her mug again. Turned it slightly in her hands. The gesture of someone choosing their words with the care you use handling something breakable. The inheritance, she said. Your grandfather's estate. I felt something tighten in my chest. What about it? Walter knew, she said. The coffee shop kept going around us. Indifferent. Ordinary. Walter knew about you, she said. About your parentage. Gerald told him, years ago. And Walter was not a man who processed complicated things easily, but he was a man who believed in fairness in a very specific, structural way. He believed that what was wrong should be made right. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Just corrected. She paused. His original will, she said, left the estate split evenly between you and Danielle. 50-50. Exactly as he told you both. It wasn't 50-50, I said. My parents told me. I know what your parents told you, Rosemary said. I know what they said the split was. But Claire, Walter's original will was 50-50. And your parents knew that. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. What happened to the original will? I said. Rosemary looked at me. That, she said, is the question you need to be asking. I need to tell you what it feels like to receive information in layers. Because that's what this was. Not one revelation but a series of them, each one arriving before you fully absorbed the last, each one changing the shape of what you thought you already understood. The first layer had been the DNA test. My father wasn't my father. The second layer was Rosemary confirming it. My mother had known from the beginning. Gerald had chosen to stay, and his choice had become the family's buried architecture. The third layer was Walter. Walter had known. Walter had, in his specific quiet way, tried to correct the record. Had written a will that treated me equally. Not because he was making a statement, but because it was simply the right thing to do, and Walter was, at his core, a man who tried to do the right thing. And now there was a fourth layer being placed in front of me, and this one had a different quality than the others. The others were painful in the way that truth is painful, in the way that clarity hurts before it helps. But this one had an edge to it. This one was the shape of something deliberate. Someone had interfered with Walter's will. I drove home from that coffee shop in a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of shock. I was past shock, or thought I was, but the silence of someone running calculations. Trying to understand what had happened, and when, and who had made it happen. Walter had died in August. He'd been sick for months before that, in and out of the hospital, staying sometimes with my parents when he needed more consistent care. My parents had been his primary support during those final months. His home. His appointments. His paperwork. His paperwork. I thought about my mother, who was organized in the specific way that slightly controlling people are organized. Who maintained files. Who knew where every document was. Who knew the name of every professional they worked with. Who ran the household administrative machinery with a particular smooth efficiency that everyone in the family accepted as simply the way things were. I thought about those months. Walter in their house. Walter's documents. Walter's attorney. And I thought about something Rosemary had said that I hadn't asked her to explain. She had said, the question you need to be asking. Not, I'll explain what happened. Not, here's what I know. She had pointed me toward a question and then stopped, and I understood, sitting in traffic on the way home, that this was intentional. That Rosemary knew things she was not going to say out loud, in a coffee shop, to me. But she was willing to point me toward the door. The question I needed to be asking was about the will. And the person I needed to talk to was Walter's attorney. His name was Martin Collier. I found him through the probate documents, which were public record. This was something I hadn't known until I sat down and started researching the process. Probate records, once filed with the court, were accessible. You could request them. You could read them. I requested Walter's. And I read them. And then I sat for a very long time with what I was reading. The will on file, the one that had been submitted for probate, the one that was the legal basis for the distribution of my grandfather's estate, was dated 14 months before his death. It was the will that granted Danielle 80% and me 20%. But probate records also sometimes contained documentation of prior wills, of amendments, of the history of a document that had been changed. And in Walter's file, there was a notation. A brief, procedural notation of the kind that lawyers include for record-keeping purposes. It referenced a prior version of the will, dated nearly 5 years earlier. The notation was dry and technical, the kind of language designed to be unreadable unless you knew what you were looking for. But what it said, essentially, was that the prior will had been superseded, replaced, by the version that was now on file. The prior will, the one that had been replaced, had been 50-50. Someone had convinced Walter to change his will in the last years of his life, during a period when he was aging, when his health was declining, when he was spending significant time in the care of my parents. And the change had given Danielle 4 times my share. I stared at those documents until they blurred. Then I called Martin Collier's office and made an appointment. His office was in a low building near downtown with a small parking lot and the specific quiet of places where serious paperwork happens. Martin Collier was in his late 60s. He had a careful, measured manner and the kind of face that gave very little away, which I imagined was a professional asset. I explained who I was. He confirmed it without much expression. He had known Walter for over 20 years. I'm trying to understand the history of my grandfather's estate planning, I said. Specifically, I'm trying to understand the circumstances around the change to his will. The one made approximately 14 months before his death. Martin Collier looked at me for a moment. I should tell you, he said carefully, that there are things I can discuss in a general capacity as they relate to a matter now in public probate record, and things I cannot discuss. I understand, I said. I'm asking about the things you can discuss. Another careful pause. Your grandfather came to me approximately 14 months before his passing, he said, and indicated that he wished to amend his testamentary documents. He had been accompanied to that appointment. I kept my expression neutral. By whom? I said. By members of his immediate family, he said. Was he, I paused, chose the word carefully. Was he under any apparent external pressure at that appointment? In your professional assessment? Martin Collier was quiet for a long moment. I will tell you, he said, that in my experience of your grandfather over 20 years, he was an exceptionally consistent man. His prior will had been in place for 5 years and reflected values he had expressed to me directly and repeatedly. The change he made 14 months before his death was. He paused again. Inconsistent with that history. Did you express concern at the time? I asked. I did, he said. To your grandfather directly. He told me the decision was his own. But he was not alone at the appointment. No, Martin said. He was not. We looked at each other across his desk. Is there anything else I should be looking into? I asked. He was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to mean something. In my experience, he said finally, when a testamentary change occurs late in life, during a period of declining health, in circumstances where the individual is heavily dependent on particular family members for daily care, those circumstances, legally speaking, can warrant scrutiny. He folded his hands on his desk. There is a legal concept, he said, called undue influence. The words sat between us in the quiet office. I know what that is, I said. Then you understand, he said, that the standard of proof for such a claim, and the potential remedies available, are matters worth discussing with a qualified attorney. I drove home from that appointment with my hands very steady on the wheel, and something building in my chest that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, and not quite satisfaction, but something that contained elements of all three. The holiday dinner was in 11 days. I had a lot to do. I need to be honest with you about something. About the part of this story that I'm least proud of, or at least the part that's most complicated to be proud of. Because during those 11 days I did things I had never done before. I operated from a place of strategy and planning and deliberate restraint in a way that felt, sometimes, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit me yet. I was not, by nature, a person who withheld. I was not someone who calculated. I had spent my whole life being transparent, emotionally available, emotionally readable, sometimes to my detriment. The contained, strategic version of myself that was moving through those 11 days felt both necessary and strange. I consulted an attorney. A real one, someone who specialized in estate litigation. I explained the circumstances, the DNA test, Walter's history of clear stated intentions, the changed will, the circumstances of the change, without yet making any formal decisions. I wanted to understand what options existed, what was possible, what the realistic timeline of something like an undue influence claim would look like. The attorney told me that cases like this were not uncommon, though they were complicated, that the standard of proof was high but not insurmountable. That documentation of Walter's prior stated wishes, combined with the timing of the change, the presence of interested parties at the signing, and evidence of his increasing dependency, could form a legitimate foundation for a claim. She also told me that before I filed anything, I should consider whether I wanted to give my parents the opportunity to respond privately. That the legal route was always available, but that sometimes the mere knowledge that it was available was itself sufficient to change a situation. I thought about that for a long time. And I thought about Danielle. Because here's the thing I kept returning to. The thing that complicated my anger and refused to let it be simple. I still didn't know what Danielle knew. I didn't know if she had been present at that appointment with Walter. I didn't know if she had participated, actively, in whatever had happened. Or if she had simply received a gift she didn't know was taken from someone else. I needed to know the difference. Not to excuse her if she had known, but because what I did next should be proportionate to what was actually true. And I was done, I was completely done, operating on assumptions. I had operated on assumptions my entire life, and it had cost me more than I had ever allowed myself to calculate. The dinner was in 5 days. I called Danielle. We met for lunch, just the two of us. Her suggestion, actually. When I called and said I wanted to see her before the family dinner, she had immediately offered to come to Columbus, which was a 2-hour drive for her. She arrived looking the way she always looked, put together, warm-smiled, the particular ease of someone who has never had to wonder if they were wanted in the room. We ordered. We made the surface conversation. And then I set down my fork and looked at her. I need to ask you something directly, I said. And I need you to be honest with me. Something shifted in her face. Fractional. Quickly controlled. Okay, she said. Were you at Grandpa Walter's attorney's office when he changed his will? Silence. A specific, weighted, terrible silence. And in that silence I had my answer, even before she said a word. Because Danielle was good at many things. She was good at warmth and ease and making rooms comfortable and saying the right thing at the right moment. But she was not, as it turned out, good at hiding guilt from the one person who had spent a lifetime studying her face. I was there, she said finally. But Claire, it wasn't. Did you encourage him to change it? It wasn't like that, she said. Her voice had changed. The ease was gone. Something underneath was showing. Mom and Dad had been talking to him for months about it. About how I had the kids and the house and the financial pressures. I was just. You were there, I said. I wasn't lobbying, I was just. Danielle. My voice was very quiet. I'm not asking you to defend it right now. I'm asking you to be honest about what happened. She looked at me for a long moment. And I saw something in her face I had never seen there before. Something that looked, under the defensiveness and the beginning of tears, like shame. They asked me to be there, she said quietly. Mom and Dad. They said Walter respected me and that my being there would help him feel comfortable with the change. I didn't ask what the before version was. I didn't ask what I was changing it from. She stopped. Her voice had gone small. I should have asked. I looked at my lunch plate. At the condensation ring my water glass had left on the table. There's something else I need to tell you, I said. And I told her about the DNA test. I watched my sister's face while I told her. I watched it the way you watch something you can't look away from even when part of you wants to. The way she went still first. That complete, sudden stillness that the body produces when the mind has stopped everything else to process something it wasn't prepared for. The color that left her face. The specific movement of her eyes, which went briefly unfocused, like someone trying to locate themselves in a room that has just rearranged itself around them. I told her plainly. Not brutally, but plainly. I told her about the kit. The percentage. The second test. The confirmation. I told her about Rosemary, and what Rosemary had confirmed. I told her that Gerald had known since before I was born. That our mother had told him. That the secret had been alive in our family for 31 years, coexisting with every Christmas morning and every dinner table and every conversation and every decision about who needed more and who could handle less. Danielle didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from any version of it I had heard before. Stripped of the ease and the warmth and the practiced social fluency. Something underneath that. Something younger and more frightened. Does that mean, she started. Stopped. Does that mean everything, the way they've always treated you? Do you think it's because? I don't know for certain, I said. But yes. I think it's connected. She put her hand over her mouth. Looked at the table. And I watched something move through her that I hadn't expected to see. Genuine grief. Not for herself. For me. The specific, belated grief of someone who has just understood a cruelty they were, without knowing it, positioned to benefit from. Claire, she said. And her voice broke on my name in a way that I had to look away from. I'm so sorry. I didn't say it was fine. I didn't perform reassurance. I just sat with it, because sitting with it was all I had the capacity for in that moment. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to the dinner, I said. And I'm going to say something. She looked at me. Nodded once, slowly. Do you want me there when you do? She said. I hadn't expected that. I looked at her. You'd do that. I said. You're my sister, she said. And her voice was quiet and without performance. Whatever that means now. Whatever all of this means, you're still my sister. And if I was there when they changed that will, the least I can do is be there when you tell the truth about it. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. It was too complicated to have one name. There was something that might have been the very earliest, most tentative beginning of something between us. Not the manufactured closeness of a family that performs togetherness. Something more honest than that. The kind that can only exist after everything false has been cleared away. The dinner was on a Saturday evening. I drove to Columbus in weather that couldn't decide between rain and something colder. The sky that particular flat gray that settles over Ohio in December like a held breath. The drive took 2 hours and I spent most of it in silence. Not music, not podcasts, just the road and the windshield wipers and my own thinking. I had spoken with my attorney twice more in the days before. I understood what I had. I understood what was available to me. And I had made a decision about how I wanted to do this. Not as a legal ambush, not with documents and citations and formal language, but as a human conversation. One that happened to be informed by everything I now knew. One that gave my parents the opportunity to tell the truth before truth was extracted from them by other means. I thought it was more than they deserved. I gave it to them anyway. Danielle was already there when I arrived. She met me at the door before I knocked, which meant she had been watching for me. She looked different than she had at lunch. More composed, but a different kind of composed. Not the ease of someone comfortable in the room, but the steadiness of someone who has decided something. She squeezed my arm once. Brief. Said nothing. I walked in. My parents' house smelled the way it always smelled at Christmas. Pine and something baking and the specific warmth of a house that has been heated against the cold outside. The table was set with the good dishes. Candles. A centerpiece my mother had clearly spent time on. Everything arranged to communicate abundance and normalcy and the uncomplicated pleasures of family. Danielle's in-laws were there. A pleasant couple from Michigan who I'd met a handful of times. Two family friends my parents had known for decades. And my parents themselves, my mother in the kitchen, directing the final stages of dinner with her characteristic efficiency, my father sitting in the living room with a drink, looking the way he always looked at family gatherings. Present but slightly removed, as if he was attending something he had agreed to but wasn't entirely sure about. He looked up when I came in. "Claire," he said. Nodded. That specific nod that had always been his version of warmth. I looked at him and thought, "You have known my whole life." I smiled. "Hi, Dad." We ate dinner first. This was my choice. I had decided that the conversation I needed to have was not going to happen over food, not in front of guests, not as a disruption to a meal that people had traveled for. I ate my mother's cooking and made conversation and watched the table the way you watch something when you're waiting for the right moment, which is to say carefully and with your whole attention even when you appear relaxed. Danielle sat across from me. Once, during a lull in the conversation, she looked at me. I looked back. Nothing communicated in the look except, "I'm here. I know. When you're ready." After dessert, the guests moved to the living room. My mother began clearing dishes. My father refilled his drink. I stood up. "Mom," I said. "Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about. Before everyone settles in. Can we go somewhere private?" My mother looked up from the dishes. Something moved across her face, a flicker of something she controlled almost immediately. "Can it wait, sweetheart? We have guests." "It can't," I said. The word landed quietly in the kitchen. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at me. Danielle appeared in the doorway. "I'm going to be part of this conversation too," she said. Her voice was calm. My mother's eyes moved to her, confused, recalibrating. We went to my father's study. The four of us. My mother closed the door behind us and then turned with a careful, managed expression that I recognized as her version of composure under pressure. "What's going on?" she said. I had thought about how to begin this. I had turned the opening over and over during those weeks of preparation, during those long walks, during the quiet hours of that long drive. And what I had decided was that the most powerful thing I could do was be completely simple. "I did a DNA test," I said, "a few months ago." The room changed. It changed the way a room changes when the temperature drops suddenly. Not in any visible, dramatic way. In the quality of the stillness. In the way my mother's managed expression went very controlled in a way that was different from its usual control. In the way my father, who had been standing near the bookshelf with his drink, went completely motionless. "The test showed that Dad and I share 24% of our DNA," I said. "I had it confirmed by a second company." "Gerald, you are not my biological father," my mother said. "Claire, I know you knew," I said. "Both of you. I know you told him before I was born. I know he chose to stay. I know Walter found out, and I know that's why his original will split the estate 50-50. I paused. I also know that something happened to that will. And I know that you were both significantly involved in his care in the months before he changed it. And I know that Danielle was at the attorney's office when the change was made. My mother had gone very still. My father was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Something that had no version of remove in it at all. Something that looked, underneath everything, like pain. I have spoken with Martin Collier, I said. And I have spoken with an estate litigation attorney. I understand what undue influence means legally. I understand what the burden of proof looks like and what the potential remedies are. I paused. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to give you the chance to be honest with me. For the first time. In my entire life. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat inside. And then my father sat down. He sat down in the chair behind his desk, heavily, like something had gone out of him. And he put his face in his hands. And I watched Gerald Ashworth, the man who had chosen to raise me and chosen to keep a secret for 31 years and chosen, somewhere along the line, to let that secret shape the way he moved through fatherhood in ways he perhaps couldn't even fully articulate. I watched him sit in his chair with his face in his hands, and I understood that whatever came next, this moment was real. This moment, at least, was not performance. My mother was different. My mother did not sit down. My mother stood near the door with her arms folded, and I could see her working through something. Working through the mathematics of what I knew and what could be proven and what the most strategic response was. And I felt something watching her do this that was not anger exactly. Something older and sadder. The specific sadness of recognizing a pattern you've seen your whole life and finally understanding what it is. Your father has always loved you, my mother said finally. Her voice was controlled. Whatever the biology is, he has always. I don't want to talk about love right now, I said. I want to talk about Walter's will. A beat. Walter made his own decisions, she started. Mom. Danielle's voice, from the corner where she'd been standing. Quiet. Firm. Stop. My mother looked at her. And whatever she saw in Danielle's face made her stop. The room was quiet for a moment. And then my father took his hands away from his face and looked at me. And what was on his face now was something I had waited 31 years for without knowing I was waiting for it. He looked at me like I was his daughter. Not the manageable one, not the capable one, not the one who didn't need as much. Like I was a person he had failed and knew it. I'm sorry, Claire, he said. The words were simple. They were not elaborate or carefully constructed. They were just true. And somehow that simplicity, after all the careful management, all the frame justifications, all the stories that had been told and retold until they sounded reasonable, the simplicity of it broke something open in me that I had not known was closed. I didn't cry. I had expected to cry. But what I felt instead was something quieter. A release of pressure that I hadn't known I was holding. My mother looked at my father. Something passed between them. The silent communication of people who have been navigating a shared secret for decades. What do you want? My mother said. Her voice was different now. The management was still there, but the pretense had gone out of it. I want the estate corrected, I said. I want what Walter originally intended. 50-50. And I want to know who my biological father is. The room went very still again. My mother closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had changed in them. Something that looked, for the first time in this conversation, like the beginning of defeat. His name is David Keene, she said quietly. He was someone I knew before your father, and I got serious. It was brief. He doesn't know about you. Is he alive? I said. As far as I know, she said. I absorbed this. The name. David Keene. A person who existed somewhere in the world who was half of my biology, who had no idea I existed. Okay, I said. I picked up my bag from where I'd set it near the door. I'm going to give you 2 weeks, I said. To talk to your attorney. To arrange for the estate to be corrected. To do this privately, without a legal filing. 2 weeks. And if we don't? My mother said. I looked at her. Then I file the claim, I said. And everything that Martin Collier knows, and he knows quite a bit, becomes part of a public court record. I opened the door of the study. Turned back once. I'm going to say goodbye to your guests, I said. And then I'm going to drive home. And I would like very much, for the next conversation we have to be an honest one. I walked out of that room and back into the warm, pine-smelling hallway of my parents' house, where the candles were still burning on the table and the good dishes were still out and everything looked, from the outside, exactly the way a normal family was supposed to look. I said goodbye to the guests. I got my coat. Danielle walked me to my car in the cold. We stood in the driveway for a moment without speaking. The rain had finally decided what it was. It was snow, barely, the first tentative kind that doesn't stick, that just falls and disappears. You okay? She said. I don't know yet, I said honestly. She nodded. For what it's worth, she said, I'm going to tell them I support whatever you decide to do. Legally. Whatever it is. I looked at her. That's going to cost you something. I know, she said. I got in my car. I drove home in the snow that didn't stick, and I let myself feel everything. The 2 weeks my mother had were the quietest of everything that had happened. Quieter than the nights after the DNA test. Quieter than the walks and the research and the coffee shop with Rosemary and the attorney's office with its careful language. Those weeks had all contained motion. The momentum of building towards something, the purposeful energy of a person in preparation. These 2 weeks contained something different. They contained waiting. And waiting, when you have already said the hardest things and can do nothing until someone else responds, has its own particular texture. It is not the waiting of suspense exactly. It is more like the waiting after a storm has passed. The air is different. The ground is changed. And you stand in the aftermath and try to understand what is still standing and what is not. I went to work. I came home. I cooked meals I actually ate this time, which felt like a small act of self-restoration. I called Rosemary once, to tell her what had happened at the dinner. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? She asked. I don't know how to answer that yet, I said. That's the right answer, she said. It means you're being honest. I thought about David Keane sometimes during those weeks. The name my mother had given me. The person who existed somewhere, who had a life, a history, a face I had never seen, who was half of the explanation for why I looked the way I looked and thought the way I thought and was put together the way I was put together. I didn't search for him yet. I wasn't ready. There is a sequence to these things, and I was still in the middle of the sequence, and I had learned enough about timing by then to understand that not everything needs to be done at once. Some things need their own season. My mother called on day 11. Not day 14. Day 11. 3 days before the deadline, which told me something. Told me that the calculation had been made, that the position had been assessed, that the most strategic path forward had been identified. My mother was, whatever else she was, efficient. We've spoken with the attorney, she said. Her voice was the careful, neutral version. The one that communicated cooperation without communicating remorse. The estate can be restructured. The correction will take some time to process legally, but it can be done. The attorney says it's straightforward enough given the probate timeline. Okay, I said. We'll need you to sign some documents, she said. And there'll be some tax implications that your attorney should review. That's fine, I said. I'll have my attorney handle it from this end. A pause. Claire, she said. I waited. I want you to know, she started and then stopped. And what happened in that stop was interesting to me. Because my mother was not a woman who stopped. She was a woman who continued, who found the right words, who managed conversations with the fluency of someone who had spent decades making difficult things sound palatable. The stop meant she was somewhere without her usual script. Somewhere uncharted. I know this is not going to be the end of this conversation, she finally said. I know there is more that needs to be said. Between us. Between you and your father. I'm not trying to compress all of that into one phone call. Good, I said. Because it won't fit. Another pause. No, she said quietly. It won't. We ended the call there. It was not a resolution. It was not forgiveness. It was not the beginning of something repaired. It was something more preliminary than any of that. The acknowledgement that a reckoning was underway, and that the reckoning was going to take the time it was going to take, and that there was no version of this that could be managed into neatness. It was, in its way, the most honest conversation my mother and I had ever had. My father called 4 days later. This surprised me more than my mother's call. Gerald had always been a man who communicated through action rather than language, who showed up to things rather than discussed them. The fact of him calling, unprompted, of his own choosing, meant something. He called on a Sunday morning. I was still in bed, half asleep, and when I saw his name on my phone I sat up and looked at it for a moment before answering. Hi, Dad, I said. And I used the word without thinking, and then sat with it after I'd said it. Dad. A word that was complicated now in a way it hadn't been before, and maybe that was going to be permanent, or maybe it was going to evolve. I didn't know yet. But I said it because it was still the truest word I had for who he was to me, biology aside. He had been there. That counted for something. It counted for a complicated, imperfect, painful something. I wanted to call, he said. Just to call. Not about the legal stuff. Your mother is handling that. A pause. I wanted to say something. Okay, I said. I made decisions, he said. A long time ago. When you were, before you were born, really. And I told myself those decisions were right. I told myself I was doing the right thing by staying. By keeping things together. He paused. I could hear him breathing, the sound of someone composing their thoughts carefully. But somewhere along the way, keeping things together started to mean keeping certain things separate. And I know that the thing I kept most separate was you. The room was quiet around me. Winter Sunday morning light coming through the curtain. I don't know how to explain why, he said. I've tried to in my head, over the years. I think it was easier. I think looking at you, fully the way a father is supposed to look at his child, required me to hold two things at once that I didn't know how to hold. The choice I'd made and what it cost. And I put that cost on you instead of carrying it myself. And I have known that for a long time and I didn't do anything about it. I was quiet. I'm sorry, he said. That's the thing I wanted to say. Not a managed version of it. Just that. I looked at the ceiling for a moment. I hear you, I said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the restoration of something to the way it was before. It was more honest than either of those things. It was the acknowledgement of a real thing said by a real person, received by a real person, without the protective layer of pretending everything was or could be fine. It was a beginning of something. I didn't know what yet. But it was real, which made it more than most of what had come before. Danielle and I had lunch again in February. Her choice of restaurant this time, somewhere nicer than the first, somewhere that suggested she had been thinking about it in advance, wanting to get it right. We talked for almost 3 hours. Not about the will, which was in the process of being corrected and which both our attorneys were handling with appropriate thoroughness. Not about our parents, not primarily. We talked about ourselves. About our actual lives, the interior ones, the ones that had never been the subject of our careful, surface-level sisterly relationship. She told me things I hadn't known about her. About the financial pressures she'd been under, which were real, I hadn't dismissed that, and also about how those pressures had been, in part, a consequence of patterns she'd never examined. Of assuming support would arrive when needed because it always had. Of building a life partly on the expectation of a safety net and never fully interrogating where that safety net came from or what it cost other people. "I've been in therapy since December," she told me. "Since the dinner. I needed someone to help me look at some things." I told her that I thought that was good. I meant it. She told me something else. Something quiet and careful and harder for her to say. "When we were growing up," she said, "I knew that things were different for you. I noticed. I told myself the story that you were the strong one, that you didn't need the same things. But I think I told myself that because it was easier than sitting with the alternative, which was that I was benefiting from something unfair. And that was uncomfortable, so I didn't look at it directly." I sat with that. "I'm not telling you this to absolve myself," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know that the blindness wasn't entirely innocent. I just wasn't brave enough to question it." This was, I thought, more honesty than I had ever received from my sister in 31 years of being her sister. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. And her voice had something in it that I recognized, under the composure, a vulnerability she usually kept very well concealed. The specific vulnerability of someone who is afraid of losing something they didn't properly value until they almost lost it. I thought about it honestly before answering. "I think we're going to be something," I said. "I don't know if it's the same as okay. I think it's going to be more honest than okay. Which I think might actually be better." She nodded. Something in her face that was relief and grief at the same time. "I can work with that," she said. Spring came slowly that year, the way it sometimes does in Ohio, tentatively, pulling back every few days into cold, as if the season itself was uncertain. But by April the trees were doing what trees do regardless of the uncertainty of the air around them. And there were mornings when I walked to work and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Unencumbered. Not happy, not exactly, not in a simple, uncomplicated way. My life was not a simple, uncomplicated thing. I was still in the early stages of understanding what my family actually was and what I wanted it to be going forward. I was still figuring out what kind of relationship was possible with my parents, what I needed from them, what I was willing to offer, where the lines were. I had not yet reached out to David Keene. I had his name, and a general sense of where he had last been located, and I was still sitting with the question of whether I wanted that door open, and what I expected to find behind it, and whether my expectations were realistic. These were not resolved things. I wasn't going to pretend they were. But there is a specific kind of freedom that comes from no longer carrying someone else's secret for them. From no longer organizing your understanding of yourself around an explanation that was always insufficient because it was built on a foundation that was never true. I had spent 31 years wondering, at some level beneath conscious thought, what was wrong with me? Why I didn't quite fit. Why the warmth in my family seemed to curve around me rather than toward me. Now I knew it wasn't me. It had never been me. That knowledge was not a cure. Knowing the reason for a wound doesn't close the wound. But it changes something essential about how you carry it. It changes the story you tell yourself about who you are. And the story you tell yourself about who you are turns out to be, quietly and over time, the most important thing. I went back to Martin Collier's office once more, in late March. Not for legal purposes. The estate matter was being handled, progressing through its careful bureaucratic stages. I went because I had something I wanted to say to him. He received me with the same measured manner, the same careful face. But when I told him what I'd come to say, something shifted in it. Something that might, on a less composed face, have been warmth. I told him that Walter had been right to put the original will the way he did. That he had seen something clearly that others in the family had chosen not to see. That whatever Walter's knowledge of the situation had been, he had responded to it with the particular simple fairness that had apparently defined him. At least in his better moments, at least when he wasn't being managed by people with interests of their own. He spoke about you, Martin said. Quietly. Carefully. I looked up. Not directly. Not by name, in that specific conversation. He paused. But in general terms, over the years, he spoke about both his granddaughters. And the things he said about you, your steadiness, your resourcefulness, those were said with a particular kind of pride. The kind that doesn't require an audience. I felt something move through me that I didn't have a name for. Thank you, I said, for telling me that. I left his office and stood for a moment in the small parking lot. The April sky was doing something complicated above me. Clouds and light negotiating, the way they do in spring. Everything looked ordinary. Everything looked like itself. I called Rosemary on the way to my car. It's done, I said when she picked up. A pause. The legal stuff. All of it, I said. I mean, it's not done, exactly. None of it is done. But I think I'm okay. Rosemary was quiet for a moment. You were always going to be okay, she said. I knew that when you were 12 years old, sitting at Gerald's table trying to make yourself smaller so nobody would notice how much you understood. I stopped walking. You noticed that? I said. I always noticed, she said. I just couldn't do anything about it. You could have told me sooner, I said. Not accusingly. Just honestly. I know, she said. I'm sorry I didn't. I was a coward about it for a long time. I thought it wasn't my place. It was, I said. It was exactly your place. Yes, she said quietly. It was. We stayed on the phone for a while after that, not saying much. Just the comfortable silence of two people who understand each other, which is rarer and more valuable than most people know. Here is what I know now, that I didn't know at the beginning of this. I know that families are not the stories they tell about themselves. They are the patterns underneath those stories, the choices made in private, the things managed and maintained and carefully kept from the light, the distance between who people say they are and what they actually do when the costs are high and the witness is only their own conscience. I know that being the capable one, the strong one, the one who doesn't need as much, that can be a real thing, a genuine quality of character, something worth honoring in yourself. But I know now that it can also be a role assigned to you by people who need you to occupy it so that something else can remain unexamined. And the difference between those two things matters enormously. I know that evidence doesn't lie in the way people do. That numbers mean what they mean. That a 24.7% match is a 24.7% match regardless of the story you've been told, regardless of the story you've been telling yourself, regardless of how much easier it would be if the number were different. I know that justice, when it comes, almost never looks the way you imagined it would. It doesn't feel like triumph. It doesn't feel like the score being settled. It feels quieter than that. It feels like standing in a parking lot in April looking at a complicated sky and feeling, for the first time in a long time, like the ground beneath you is actually there. I know that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation, and reconciliation is not the same as trust, and trust is not something you grant because it's the generous thing to do. Trust is built slowly, in the space created by honesty, by changed behavior, by the accumulated evidence of people actually doing what they say. My parents and I are in the very early stages of something that might, over a long time, become a different kind of relationship. It requires them to continue being honest. It requires me to continue being willing. Neither of those things is guaranteed. Both of them are being attempted. I know that Danielle and I are becoming, slowly and imperfectly, something more genuine than what we were. That genuine is harder than easy. That I prefer it anyway. And I know this. I am the daughter of a woman who made a choice she kept hidden for 31 years, and a man who chose to stay and couldn't quite carry that choice with the grace it required, and a grandfather who quietly tried to set something right, and somewhere out there a stranger named David Keane who has no idea I exist. I am made of all of that. The secrets and the choices and the corrections and the silences and the one old man on a dock who held my hand in the early morning and said, "You're a good girl, Claire, you're a very good girl." I am all of that. And I am also just myself. 31 years old. Sitting in an apartment that is mine, that I built with my own capable hands, that belongs to no story except the one I am writing now. That is enough. That is, it turns out, more than enough. If this story moved something in you, if you recognized even a piece of it, if something in Claire's journey felt true to something in your own, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Tell me what you would have done differently, or what you've lived through that made this feel real. Subscribe if you want to stay in this space, because there are more stories coming. Real, human, complicated stories about the families we're born into and the selves we build in spite of them. And share this with someone who needs to hear that being the quiet one, the strong one, the one everyone assumed would be fine, that person deserves to be seen too. This story is inspired by real online experiences. Names, details, and situations may have been changed for storytelling and privacy purposes.